So you want to be a photographer. Perfect. But you don't know anything. All you know is that thing that takes pictures is called a camera. Well, we all had to start somewhere. In today's video, we're going to be going over basic terms, things like shutter speed, aperture, ISO. This will be the groundwork for later videos. We will go more in depth about these topics, but for right now, we want to get you familiar with the terms, so that way later on, it is easier to learn them. Let's go. How's it going, everybody? My name is Brian Davis, and this is the premiere episode of Photo 101, the series where we teach you about photography. Without further ado, we're going to jump right on into it because that's what you're here for. The terms I'm going to be going over in this video are some that you absolutely need to know in order to do anything in photography because they are used virtually everywhere. Everywhere in the photography world. Everywhere in the photography world, not in the real world. Some of these you'll hear in the real world, but not all of them. Without further ado, we're going to jump right on into it with the three terms you need to know first: shutter speed, ISO, and aperture. Shutter speed, ISO, and aperture are the three things that you need to work literally any camera. It is the same thing that runs this camera from 1950, and that runs the camera that's taking this video right now. These three basic principles are in every camera. The problem with explaining all these three is that they work in tandem, so they all work together to make the photo right. So we're going to start with aperture, because aperture is on the lens, not the camera, although the lens can be attached to the camera because that's usually how they work. Aperture has to do with the internal optics of the lens that attaches to the camera. And what the aperture is, oh my lord, aperture is the hole that is in the lens, and that's the very basic way I can say that. It is the opening in the lens that allows light to pass through onto the image sensor. The image sensor is the sensor on the back of the camera that allows the picture to be taken. It's either a sensor on digital cameras or film on film cameras. The aperture opens a hole and lets a lot of light in, so that way the camera can capture it. Now, the bigger the hole, the more light gets let in. The smaller the hole, the less light gets in. It's very straightforward and intuitive. Now, another thing with the aperture is the bigger the aperture, the blurrier the background will be. So you can tell right now that I've got my aperture open really wide to 2.8. I'll explain what that means in a second. To 2.8. My background is pretty blurry, but I'm very in focus. Whereas if I were to bring it down to f4, first of all, you're going to notice it's going to get darker. And second of all, as I adjust, you'll notice it's not as blurry as it used to be. I'm going to put some pictures up that show you this example too. The difference between open wide and not open as wide. Now here's something to remember. The smaller the aperture number, the wider it opens. So f2.8 is a bigger opening than f4, which is backwards and is confusing. Now there's a set of mathematics as to what these mean, but I don't know them right now, and in a later video I will explain this to you. But you don't need to worry about that. All you need to know is the smaller the number, the bigger the aperture. So a 1.8 lens is going to be really big, a 2.8 is going to be pretty big, 4 is going to be reasonably small, 8's smaller, 16's even smaller. Something also to note is the bigger the aperture, the more expensive the lens is going to be. So a 1.2 lens is going to be huge. It is going to be really expensive compared to a 1.8 lens. I own a 1.8 lens. It is my favorite lens. For example, this picture was taken using a 50mm 1.8 lens. This picture was also taken a 50mm 1.8 lens. As a matter of fact, all of these pictures were taken using a 1.8 lens because it's just that magic lens. Now, here's what the aperture looks like on a lens. See, if you look down into the glass there, you're going to see, whoop, whoop. There you go. You're going to see it opens, whoop. That's a big aperture and that's a smaller aperture. Bigger, smaller. Now, in a later video, when we get into the difference between zoom and prime lenses, we're going to explain why certain lenses are much more expensive for being, 70 to 200 f2.8, 16 to 35 f2.8, why they're more expensive. But for right now, all you need to know is the bigger the aperture, the blurrier the background, and the better your image quality. The other thing to remember with Aperture is the bigger the hole, the more light's going to be let in. So that way, your shutter speed, which is what we're about to get to, your shutter speed is going to compensate. Now, what is shutter speed? Your shutter is the mechanism inside the camera that opens and closes to allow light to hit the sensor at a certain rate. So for instance, at 1/10 of a second, it is going to open for 1/10 of a second and let light in for 1/10 of a second and then close. At 1/8000th of a second, it's going to do the same thing. And at 30 seconds, it's going to open for 30 seconds, let all that light in, and then close. Now, obviously, if you're outside on a really bright day and you have a really wide aperture, because you want to get those nice blurry backgrounds, you're going to want to bring your shutter speed way up so that way you can darken the image. You have to think of it in another way. If it's open for 10 seconds, you're going to let a lot of light in. But if it's open for 1/8000th of a second, you're not going to let as much light in because it's only open for a very small amount of time. You're not able to see as much. Whereas if it's open for 10 seconds, you're able to get a nice long look at it. The other thing that shutter speed is good for is capturing motion. So if you have a high shutter speed, 1/8000th of a second, everything that you capture in that 1/8000th of a second is going to be frozen because you don't move that much in 1/8000th of a second. On the other side of the spectrum, if you are open for 30 seconds, you're going to get a lot of blurry things because a lot of things move in 30 seconds. When in portraiture, usually I try to use a 2.8 lens or a 1.8 lens, so it's nice and wide, I get nice blurry backgrounds, so I'm usually using 1/400th or 1/800th of a second when I'm outside, unless I'm in the shade, because if it's darker, I want to bring the shutter speed down so I let a little bit more light in. Now, let's say you're inside, you're at a basketball game, and you have your aperture really wide, because you want to get as much light in as possible because you're inside, and you have your shutter speed pretty high, you maybe 1/320th of a second, because you want to capture the basketball players, you want to capture the action, and you're looking at your image and it's really dark, and you're like, well, I can't bring the shutter speed down because it'll be blurry, and I can't open the aperture more because I can't go anymore. So what do? That's where ISO comes in. Now, ISO means two things. It's either the film sensitivity, if you're using film, or the sensitivity of your sensor. For instance, basically enhancing your image digitally on digital cameras, you're brightening it up in the camera. If you're outside, it's already pretty dark, and you need it to be a little bit brighter, you turn up your ISO, and the image becomes brighter. It's almost like you're in Photoshop, and the image is kind of dark, so you're like, I need to add light to this, and you swipe up that slider, and it gets a little bit brighter. That's basically what it is in the camera. So the higher the ISO, the brighter it's going to be. The lower the ISO, the lower it's going to be. So if you're outside on a really bright day, you're at 1/8000th of a second, and you get your aperture really open and it's still a little bright, you need to check your ISO and bring it down to as low as possible, and that'll darken it. The problem with ISO, if you're sitting there, you're like, well, why don't I just boost it on? I keep my settings the same and change the ISO. You can. The problem with ISO is, especially with slightly older cameras, it's getting better nowadays. With slightly older cameras, the higher the ISO, it is going to become grainier. The image is going to become grainier, more pixelated. And I'll put some examples on the screen now where you can see the grain. The higher your ISO goes, the grainier it's going to look. I think I might be able to do one in camera, actually, if I bring this way down. You're going to notice I'm at the highest ISO this can go. It's probably going to look pretty grainy right now because that ISO is as high as it goes, 25,600. It's very, very, very bright ISO. And if I bring my aperture back down, you're going to find out. Whoop. Now I'm at 2.8. Very, very bright, so I want to turn that ISO back down. Note I'm shooting at 1/50th of a second shutter speed. Bring it back down to 1250. And we're back. I'm letting the light do as much as possible so I don't need to brighten it up and get pixelated. A couple more basic terms to know here. Underexposed versus overexposed. This is really easy. An overexposed shot looks like this. This is overexposed. Everything's washed out. You can't see any detail. Saving shots like this in Photoshop are kind of difficult because you can't tell. If you bring the whites down, you won't be able to see anything. So you want to avoid shots like this. On the other end of the spectrum, an underexposed shot. This is an underexposed shot. I found that these are a little bit easier to save in Photoshop, but you usually don't want to aim for underexposed. You want to aim for perfectly exposed. And a perfectly exposed shot, or at least closer to it, is what a better exposed shot looks like. Now I do like mine on the darker end a little bit because I'm able to, in Photoshop, brighten it up a little bit. Brightening it up, again, I have found it's easier than darkening it, so that's why I err on the side of caution. But don't worry about editing. Editing comes later. That's all I have for you today. Shutter speed, ISO, aperture, underexposed, and overexposed. Here's what I need you to do, a little bit of homework. I need you to go find yourself a camera, either digital camera or your phone will be fine, and go take some pictures. Any pictures. They don't even have to be good. I'm not expecting them to be good. All I need you to do is think about these things when you're taking your picture, thinking about how you're exposing your shot, thinking about what you're taking a picture of. In this video, I did not discuss composition, subject, anything like that. That's going to be Camera Basics Part 2, coming next week. So for now, think about what you want to take pictures of. Maybe it's people, maybe it's nature, maybe it's your cat. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked this video and you found it helpful, go ahead, give it a like and a comment. Subscribe if you'd like to hear my voice even more, and I will see you in the next video. Goodbye. How's it going, everybody? My name is Brian Davis, and in this video, yay! In this series where we teach you about the photography. Hey, how's it going, everybody? My name is Brian Davis, and in this